Hi, I'm John Nunn, and in this video I'm going to talk about one of our best-selling endgame books, Fundamental Chess Endings, by two Germans, Grandmaster Carsten Müller and Frank Lamprecht. This book was originally published in 2001, and it followed on from a long history of chess endgame encyclopedias, going back to Reuben Fine's Basic Chess Endings. There have been many multi-volume endgame encyclopedias over the decades, for example Averbach's series, which were able to cover endgames in more detail. But this book does a good job of compressing all the most important information into one admittedly rather thick volume of over 400 pages. The print price is $29.95, but you can also get the Kindle version, which is a bargain at $9.95, or the app version, $14.99, where you can play over all the moves on the screen using our Chess Studio app, which is in fact what I'm using to show you the moves here. Well, like many encyclopedias, it can be used in a variety of different ways as a reference work, or to study one particular endgame, or as I quite often like to use such books for just browsing and general entertainment and picking out things that look really interesting. Well, I'm going to use some positions from this book to explain some things about a certain type of bishop and pawn endgame, which I hope will be quite instructive. So let's go to the first position, which we have here. A lot of people will be familiar with this position. It's white has king, bishop and pawn, black has a lone king, and amazingly position is a draw. It's one of the beauties of chess that a relatively straightforward set of rules about how the pieces move can lead to quite complicated and paradoxical situations. And that's what we have here. We have a material advantage, which would normally be amply sufficient to win, but owing to the fact that white has a rook's pawn and his bishop does not control the promotion square of the pawn, it's actually a draw. For example, let's suppose that if white plays his bishop to d6 immediately, it's stalemate. Of course, white can wait, pass move with his bishop. Black moves his king to b8. But now you can see it's quite difficult for white to do anything. If he pushes the pawn, black just tucks his king away into the corner, and white either stalemates by moving his king to a6 or c7, or he has to let the king out of the box. But then he can't really do anything. Black just oscillates with his king between a8 and b7, and white either can't make any progress or he stalemates the king. It's very odd, but there's no way for white to make progress here. It's just a simple draw. Well, this drawing position is the basis for quite a lot of interesting play in endgames where white has this rook's pawn plus wrong bishop combination. And if I just jump to the next position I want to show you. Okay, this is an exercise in the book, and I should say that the book has a large number of exercises which are very useful for testing whether you've grasped the basic principles. So here you can see we have the same general type of position. White has a rook's pawn and a bishop that does not control the promotion square of the pawn. But there's an important caveat to this draw, and that is that the defending side here, black, can only draw if he can get his king in front of the pawn to the corner square. If he's unable to do this, then the bishop and pawn generally win. So it's white to play here, and as the text says, you don't have to let the black into the corner, but there's only one move that wins in this position. Perhaps you'd like to think for a few moments and pause the video and see if you can work out which move it is that wins the game for white here. Alright, let's have a look at the solution. If we scroll down, it's wrong to push the pawn. Black plays his king up. Now he's threatening to actually win the pawn by playing his king to g6. So if white stops that, black then goes king to g8, king to h8, he's in the corner, and we have the draw that we saw from the previous position. So the only move to win is to play bishop to e6. This prevents the black king coming to f7. And if the king goes to f8, then white advances the pawn, and now the pawn and bishop control g7 and g8. Bishop also controls f7, so the king has to step away, but then the pawn rushes through. So after white's first move, black's best chance is to play his king to e7. White, of course, pushes the pawn. Black can't take the bishop, because then he can't stop the pawn. King has to go to f6. Now again he's threatening this draw with king to g6, winning the pawn, and pushing the pawn doesn't help because the king runs into the corner. But the winning move is to play the bishop now to f5. Once again the bishop and pawn form a sort of barrier. King, of course, can't take the bishop without allowing the pawn through. So black's only chance is to try to get the king again into the corner via g8 and h8. But white again prevents this, using his bishop to firm up the barrier, now controlling all three of these squares. It looks odd to put the bishop in front of the pawn, but by creating this barrier, white gives himself time to bring his king up. Black continues to try to approach the pawn, now threatening to win it with king to g5. But white's in time to bring his king up. And now is pretty much the end. White simply advances his king, and sooner or later the black king is forced to step away, and white just simply moves his bishop out of the way and then promotes the pawn with an easy win. In fact, it's mate next move in this position. So the king has to get in front of the pawn for it to be a draw. So that doesn't seem perhaps too complicated, but let's see what happens if we introduce an additional feature. Well, what happens if black has some pawns? Here we again have the situation in which white has the rook's pawn and wrong bishop, but now black has two pawns. Well, normally having two pawns more is an advantage, but in this case it can be actually a disadvantage for a reason which we'll see in a few moments. The two positions I've shown you previously are the kind of simple end of the positions in the book, and this is one of the more complicated positions. Well, if we just have a look at the diagram in the text of the book itself, it shows a coloured drawing zone. The position is a draw if the black king can occupy one of the squares in the zone. Notice that h8 is missing from the zone. And it seems odd, because normally you would expect the king to be best placed in the a8 corner, where it can blockade the pawn. But actually the black king needs a bit of space, and black can draw if his king is, roughly speaking, in the upper right corner, apart from the actual corner square. Then if white races with his king to take both the pawns, black has time to get his king to the corner. But he mustn't go into the corner too early, and we'll see why that is if we play over what happened in this game between over and by. Let's take a look, see what happened. White manoeuvred. Black, however, was defended accurately, keeping his king in the drawing zone. And white now brought his king back, and this is a clever idea because it's tempting black to move his king into the top left corner, and that's actually a mistake. So black seems to be under the impression that the way to save this game is to play his king to a8. He should, as I say, have kept his king in this general area. So now black goes here. Actually, just at this moment it's still a draw, and black could have drawn here by giving away this pawn. If white takes it with the bishop, then it is a draw with the king in the corner. But on the other hand, if white takes it with the pawn, black brings his king to b5 and then uses this pawn to deflect the bishop. Bishop would have to come to e5 to prevent promotion, and then the black king can take the pawn. So right here, black actually had a tactical draw by pushing the pawn. Instead, he played his king here, and now you see why it loses to have the king in the top left-hand corner. White continued king here, black played here, and white played here. And black actually resigned at this point because after here, white stalemates the black king and forces him to play his only legal move, which is to push the pawn, and this allows white to convert his relatively useless A pawn into a far more useful B pawn. White takes, and the bishop drops back, but now it's an easy win. White just wins by pushing his pawn and using his bishop at the appropriate moment to finish black off like this. Now the bishop jumps in with mate. Well, there's one other variation, is if black plays his king here, this actually leads to an even quicker defeat because it's mate in 3. Once again, white uses the idea of stalemating the enemy king to force him to give up his b pawn, and here it leads to immediate mate. So actually the presence of the two black pawns is a handicap to black in several positions because it provides him with a legal move after his king has been stalemated. And white uses this to improve his pawn from an A pawn to a B pawn and can win the game. So it's a useful thing to know that if you do have these additional pawns, the normal rule, the king belongs in front of the enemy pawn, is an exception to this rule. The king should instead stay in this area where it can go into the corner, can go into the upper left-hand corner if white takes the pawns. But it's not actually in danger of being stalemated. That's quite a tricky point. And let's have a look at an exercise which is based on a sort of similar principle. Here's the position. It's white to play. He actually only has one move to draw here. So perhaps you'd like to consider what that might be. I should say this is a fairly tricky position. But have a think about it and see what you come up with. Let's have a look to see what the solution is. Well, it looks normal to take the pawn, but then again we have this situation where white is actually handicapped by having these pawns in many variations. Let's see what happens. Black just blockades the pawn, and then he uses his king to drive the white king into the corner. White can't avoid this, otherwise black just takes both the pawns with his king and promotes the h pawn. So it's all pretty much forced, and now comes the moment where black releases the stalemate, allowing white to advance the pawn, but of course it leads to a quick mate. So once again the white pawns prove his undoing and allow black to win a position which would otherwise be a draw. But white can draw in this position, and the idea is to play the rather paradoxical move h4. And it's paradoxical because it just puts the pawn where it can be taken. But as I've said, these extra pawns can prove a handicap. So here, even though black can keep his g pawn, white gets to black can keep his f pawn rather, white gets to draw. So let's see what happens. If black takes the pawn, then it's a much more simple draw. Black moves his bishop out of the way, and white just gets rid of his pawn like this and brings his king back into the corner with the same draw that we saw in the very first position. So if black wants to try to win, he has to keep the f pawn, and the most natural way to do that is to defend it with the bishop. But now white gets the h pawn instead, and it turns out that this position is a draw. white can use the h-pawn in an aggressive mode to keep the black bishop tied down. Let's see how that works. Now the pawn's got as far as h7, the black bishop is now restricted to moving up and down the long diagonal. But here's a kind of critical moment. White actually has to use his king in an aggressive way. If he starts to play passively, then he'll lose. Let's see why that is. Now black plays a waiting move with his bishop. And after the bishop comes to d4, white is in Zugzwang. If he moves the king, the g-pawn is captured and the f-pawn promotes. But on the other hand, if white gives away his h-pawn by promoting, he just loses his g-pawn in a few moves in any case. So white mustn't retreat with the king, instead he has to advance using the king actively. And we can see why that draws, because he gets his king behind the enemy pawn like this. And now there's not much black can do, because if he takes the pawn, and there's really no other way he can consider making progress, white promotes to deflect the enemy bishop and, of course, captures black's last pawn with a draw. So quite tricky play can arise where you have this rook's pawn and wrong bishop combination, particularly if the defending side has pawns as well, which might interfere with the attempt to stalemate the king in the corner. Okay, one of the more complicated, well, perhaps really at the upper end of difficulty for this book. It's a really worthwhile book with a huge amount of material in it. If you're really willing to apply yourself to studying the book, I'm sure it will improve your endgame play and your chess in general. Well, thanks for listening to this video about fundamental chess endings, and I look forward to seeing you for the next video.